What happens when a team humiliates you in your own stadium? And then, just 2 months later, you walk into their home? You don't just want revenge. You want to make them remember your name. On November 25, 2003, Arsenal walked into the San Siro with their Champions League campaign hanging by a thread. Waiting for them was Inter Milan, the same Inter Milan that had already beaten Arsenal 3-0 at Highbury. And at the center of that painful defeat was Thierry Henry. He had missed a penalty. Inter had destroyed Arsenal. Now Arsenal had to face them again, but this time something was different, because Thierry Henry wasn't walking into the San Siro looking for redemption. He was walking in ready to take the entire game away from Inter. Before we relive Henry's unforgettable night in Milan, subscribe to the Ballers Zone and hit the bell. Now let's go back to the San Siro. The first meeting at Highbury had been a disaster. Inter walked away with 3 goals and 3 points. Arsenal were left with questions. Could they actually compete with Europe's biggest teams? 2 months later, Arsenal traveled to Milan, and Henry had unfinished business. The atmosphere was completely different from Highbury. The rain had fallen over Milan. The stadium was packed. Inter supporters were expecting another Arsenal collapse. Across the pitch stood players like Javier Zanetti, Marco Materazzi, Fabio Cannavaro, Christian Vieri, and Obafemi Martins, players who knew exactly how to survive European nights. But there was one thing they couldn't prepare for. Henry wasn't going to play like a normal striker. From the opening minutes, he began drifting away from the center. He dropped deeper. He moved toward the left. He collected the ball outside the penalty area. And every time he did, Inter's defenders had a decision to make. Follow him or leave him. And both choices were dangerous, because Henry wasn't simply waiting inside the box. He wanted to run at Inter. He wanted to isolate defenders. He wanted space. And eventually he found it. 25 minutes. Arsenal moved the ball forward. Henry received possession. There was a small gap outside the box. For most players, it wasn't enough. For Henry, it was an invitation. One touch, one look. And then the shot, low, precise, into the corner, goal. The San Siro went quiet. Henry had his revenge. But the match was far from over, because Inter Milan had their own answer. Christian Vieri received the ball and struck from distance. The shot took a deflection off Sol Campbell. Jens Lehmann could do nothing. 1-1. The stadium came alive again. Inter had survived the first blow, and now Arsenal had to survive the response. For the rest of the first half, the game became a battle. Neither side wanted to give the other the decisive opening. Henry was constantly moving, and every time he touched the ball, the Inter defense seemed to retreat. He wasn't just looking for the next pass. He was waiting for the moment when the entire defense would make one mistake. At halftime, the score is 1-1, and nobody knew what was coming next, because 4 minutes after the restart, Arsenal struck again. Inter were suddenly exposed. Leyenberg finished. Now Inter had a problem. They needed a goal, so they pushed forward, and that was exactly what Henry wanted. Because there is one thing a striker like Henry fears more than anything else. Crowded defense. No space. No room to run. But when Inter started chasing the game, the spaces appeared. And suddenly, Henry had an entire stadium to attack. Inter kept coming. Vieri tried to lead the response. Martins offered speed. Zanetti tried to keep his team organized. But Arsenal were beginning to find the gaps. Still, the game remained alive. 2-1. Then came the 85th minute. The moment that transformed this from a great Arsenal victory into a legendary Thierry Henry performance. Henry received the ball near the halfway line. He turned, and there was space ahead of him. He started running. Zanetti moved toward him, but Henry kept going. The defender tried to contain him. Henry carried the ball closer. One defender, then another. The San Siro was watching, and for a few seconds, it felt like the entire stadium was waiting to see whether someone could finally stop him. Nobody did. Created a tiny opening, and calmly placed the finish into the corner.
Henry will have to do it alone. Ah! Sensational!
Henry had done it. He had practically created the goal himself, from the middle of the pitch through Inter's defense into their penalty area and into the net. And suddenly, the players who had beaten Arsenal 3-0 at Highbury were staring at a completely different team. But Henry wasn't finished, not even close. Inter were broken. Arsenal smelled blood. And the next attack came almost immediately. Henry was involved again. The attack continued. The ball reached Edu. Finish. 3 minutes after Henry's second goal, Arsenal had scored again. The San Siro had gone from celebrating an expected Inter victory to watching their team collapse. And then came the fifth. At the San Siro, against Inter Milan. And 3 of those goals had arrived in the final 5 minutes. The stadium was stunned. Arsenal players were celebrating. Inter players were looking around as if they couldn't understand how the match had disappeared so quickly. And in the middle of everything stood Thierry Henry. 2 goals, 2 assists, a 5-1 victory. One of the greatest individual Champions League performances of his career. But the numbers don't explain what made the night so frightening. It was the way Henry played. He wasn't simply standing inside the penalty area waiting for crosses. He wasn't just finishing chances created by teammates. He was everywhere. He came deep. He carried the ball. He created chances. He attacked defenders. He scored. He assisted. He controlled the tempo of Arsenal's attacks. And most importantly, Inter never knew where he was going to appear next. If Materazzi stepped forward, Henry could run behind him. If Zanetti backed away, Henry could shoot. If another defender came across, Henry could release the ball. And when Inter pushed their defensive line higher, there was nobody better in Europe at attacking the space behind it. That was the terrifying thing about Henry. You couldn't defend him with one solution. If you gave him space, he would punish you. If you closed him down, he could beat you. If you followed him, he could drag you away and create space for someone else. And if you thought the danger was finally gone, he would appear somewhere else. That night, Inter experienced all of it. But there was another reason this performance mattered so much. Remember what happened at Highbury. Henry had missed the penalty. Inter had won 3-0. Martins had been one of the players Arsenal struggled to contain. The narrative was that Inter had exposed Arsenal. Now, Arsenal had walked into Milan and reversed everything. The same team that had scored 3 at Highbury had conceded 5 at home. And the player who had missed the penalty in London had scored twice in Milan. It wasn't just revenge, it was a transformation. Henry had shown that he could respond to failure on the biggest stage. And perhaps the most incredible part came at the end. With the match already decided, Arsene Wenger took Henry off in the final minutes. And as he walked toward the touchline, the San Siro applauded him. From that night forward, European defenders knew exactly what Arsenal's number 14 could do. But perhaps they still didn't fully understand how good he was about to become. Because this performance came just months before one of the greatest individual seasons in Premier League history. The following season, Arsenal would become the Invincibles. 38 league matches, no defeats, and Henry would score 30 Premier League goals. That was Thierry Henry. And at the San Siro, the world got one of the clearest demonstrations of it. The final whistle came. Arsenal had won 5-1. Inter had been destroyed. And Henry had delivered the performance everyone would remember. But there was one final detail. The man who had missed a penalty at Highbury had walked into Milan under pressure. He walked out having scored 2 goals and created 2 more. The man who had once been questioned as a striker had become one of the most complete forwards in world football. And the man standing in front of the Inter defense that night wasn't simply Arsenal's best player. He was becoming the nightmare every defender hoped they wouldn't have to face. Because when Thierry Henry saw space, he didn't hesitate. He attacked it. And on that unforgettable night in Milan, There was nowhere for Inter to hide. That was the night Thierry Henry became one of the most feared strikers in football. That night at the San Siro wasn't the beginning of Thierry Henry's greatness. He was already great, but it was the night the football world saw just how terrifying his greatness could become. One match, 2 goals, 2 assists, 5 Arsenal goals, 1 stunned San Siro, and 1 unforgettable message sent to Europe. Thierry Henry was no longer coming for the best defenders. He had already arrived. And perhaps that's why, almost 2 decades later, when people talk about the greatest individual performances in Champions League history, this night still deserves a place among them. Because some matches give you 3 points, some give you a trophy, and some give you a moment that defines a player forever. For Thierry Henry, that moment happened in Milan, at the San Siro, against Inter, on a night when one of football's most elegant strikers became one of its most feared. And the most frightening part? He was only getting started. If this story showed you why Thierry Henry was one of football's most feared strikers, subscribe to the Ballers Zone and hit the bell for more cinematic football stories. And tell us in the comments, was Henry at his absolute best on this night? See you in the next one.
This guy used to end careers, man, in the Premier League.